Hello, everybody. Welcome. Monday afternoon. It's funny. I heard Kurt Jaimungal use a very peculiar phrase, which he went on to explicate a little bit in a, as usual, accessible, profound, brilliant way. It's funny, I'm looking at a gopher and it's looking at me, with its left eye. And I'm standing right near it. It's looking at me with its left eye again, turned its face all the way to check me out. But also, whether an animal or a human being uses its left or right eye to explore the world with, or, obviously they're both linked. Okay, this turns out to be a really important metaphor. So, I've studied hemispheric lateralization for a long time. Prior to Ian McGilchrist's work, I was already deeply aware of this problem, and I didn't so much learn it from reading books on neuroscience. I had non-ordinary assistance. Right? Effectively, in so much as I can understand what happened and refer to it in any kind of language, which pretty much doesn't work. Apparently, what it seemed like, presuming that anything can seem like what I'm about to say, I was being educated in real time every day by a non-human intelligence, and that's where I learned to be really interested in the differences between the hemispheres on the surface of the brain, and then maybe particularly also the hippocampus, and the the corpus callosum, right? Corpus obviously means body. I'm not sure what hippo means in camp. They mean things. These words, these word fragments, they mean things. So I become very interested in them because it was shown to me that they were crucially important, not merely in the development of our species, as if that could be mere, right? Language is really weird, not merely in a universal sense, but yeah, not merely in the development of our species, but in the development of each of our own minds and lives, because it was strongly suggested to me that from the time we are conceived until the time we die, we are uniquely wandering through the terrain of reiterating the phases of the development of human minds over the history of our species, and perhaps before. There was a long time ago, I don't know, 80, 110, 130 years ago or something, a man who suggested, and it looks compelling on the surface, right? Suggested that the embryology of human beings recapitulates the development of the forms of life on Earth. So it basically, from conception to birth, or conception to some portion of embryology, or embryogenesis, where what you have is, a highly developed, effectively human fetus at some phase in the development inside the womb. The process apparently comes to a conclusion, but doesn't. And this is one of the most staggering. I want you to imagine for a moment let's not be too concerned with whether his perspective was true or not. Imagine that there's something very important we can see together from supposing that perspective, right? As I understand it, in the strangely materialistly, in the strange physical materialism and eliminative materialism bias library of modern science, and it's not too hard to see how you get there, right? Because you need to know. That's a night heron. Oh, I didn't mean to correct you. I'm sorry.
I'm no zoologist.
These are quite rare.
You don't see this too much.
It's very uncommon to see them.
Must be a lucky day.
This one has learned that people feed ducks here,
Oh, yeah.
and that draws fish to the surface.
Pretty sure we're not supposed to, right?
Right.
The hair on the back of the head, that feather is
Sorry, bud, I don't got nothing for you.
It's very uncommon to be this close to one of these birds. I think it has somehow learned either to not fear the humans. Oh, I see what's going on. Someone's been putting out seed, and it's interested in food on the land, which is uncommon. Or maybe it just came up there to take a dump because that's what it did. And if effectively that's something like a don't poop in the water, right? Idea. Which I think is probably true. Right? It's a dumb thing to poop into water you eat out of. Unless you're human, in which case that's the first thing you do, especially as a society, right? You do that, and then you charge people to fix the problems, right? It's an economic benefit. And the same thing goes for ideology. All right. So, recursive, reiterative embryogenesis, right? So it's like this is an expansion of the original idea, which is just reiterative embryogenesis. The embryo goes through the phases of the development of complex animals on Earth, right? It sort of starts out as a pollywog, and the idea was that if one sort of sliced up the time frames of the embryo's genesis, what you would see are images of the newly emergent complex form in the environment over evolutionary time, right, from the beginning to now. But what I'm going to talk about and go beyond very quickly is just something more interesting, right? That idea is very important. It doesn't matter if it's true. It's important to be able to think and imagine and see this way, because there are many features of nature that aren't explicitly yes or no. Yes, it's true, or no, it's not. In fact, we will quickly understand if we just take a look at human cognition that whether yes, it's true, or no, it's not depends sort of on where in the sphere of possibilities of angles of concern, right? Angles of purpose. Where in that sphere you're coming from and why. Your purpose will determine how you read the data, especially if you're biased to seek a specific conclusion, such as, well, there's no evidence of that, therefore it's impossible. Right? Well, you hear this kind of talk all the time about things in physics. It's impossible to travel instantaneously between two planets. What's impossible is that anyone could know that, especially now on Earth. We think that what we've discovered, we treat the field of knowledge generally as if what we have discovered is a complete guide to everything, which cannot be the case. This is like a child presuming that because they form the concept associated with human silverware, right? They finally understood the idea of, oh, you hold this thing, it's made in a factory, it's made of metal, usually, and you manipulate the food with it to facilitate easy eating, easy, unmessy eating. Imagine a child who, this is their first, which is ridiculous, it wouldn't happen. This is their first concept, and they now think, I have mastered the universe. This is how our species treats knowledge, generally. Or at least a broad cohort of the population and scientists often speaks as if this is the case, which is bogglingly idiotic. So let's imagine that reiterative embryogenesis is happening, or that something very closely resembling it is happening. And then instead of just reading the sort of evolutionary record from start to now, what is happening is that the embryo is actually testing the environment and temporality and adjusting its development to those signals such that it's generally reiterating, right, the history of evolution of animals, but it's also leaping forward into the future, sensing that and incorporating that information somehow into its developing form. In a sense, you could imagine that the embryo is attempting, in a sort of a heartbeat fashion, right, to go evolutionary history, close future, medium future, far future. Then gets that data, encodes that into the next query for evolutionary history, establishes form inside itself, and then goes forward, reads the future, and includes that information to whatever degree it can. So that's recursive reiterative embryogenesis. Right? Now, I can't remember exactly why these two words are used, but once the embryo's first cell, right? I used to have this slogan, remember your first cell, back in the 80s when I started studying biology and had my mind completely blown out of its sockets, because minds have sockets, don't you know? There's the gametes, or the gametes, I think it's gamete, it's G-E-M-E-T-E, which are the egg cell and sperm cell. And the politics of how they meet is staggeringly beautiful and complex, because what definitely doesn't happen is that the sperm cells have a race and the best one wins, like it's a competition. That is not what is going on there. What is going on there is hypersensing at the scale of cell cohorts on the side of the sperm, and extreme hypersensing on this case of the egg, such that very subtle, extremely subtle fields of information are exchanged, modulated. The sperm cells do not race, they draft, right? So drafting is a situation where the cohort can promote someone to the front, so to speak. Can promote, again, a smaller cohort of sperm cells are promoted to positions of high opportunity for fertilization. And then when, one or more sperm arrive in the proximity of the egg can modulate something resembling an electromagnetic manifold to apparently participate in selection of nearby sperm. Now, it probably doesn't have a long time window that it can do that. That's probably a process where if you get 4 or 5 sperm in near proximity, the egg can exert a selective situation on them, as I understand it. And once again, I'm not trying to say exactly what is true here, and neither am I trying to make things up. I'm proposing a theoria, if you will, a useful as if perspective, though I'm pretty sure there's some evidence for this particular argument. And then the cell immediately, after penetration, what happens is that so the sperm are driven by a spindle, and that spindle, which is essentially, you could think of it as the motor, or more organically, the legs, right, of the sperm, what it runs with, what it uses to run. That spirochete-like element could also be thought of as a racehorse. That spindle pushes the little bundle of the little potent package that gets delivered through the egg's membrane. That spindle is formed of mitochondrial DNA. In fact, it's really just a strand of mitochondrial DNA. And in that sense, it is an organism unto itself. It is effectively the DNA of the mothers, the whole matrilineal line, all the way back to mitochondrial Eve, supposedly. That's the DNA that is the engine that pushes the sperm to meet the egg, so to speak, draws them together, right? And that's a profound temporal event. That's the birth of a universe, right? This is not, if you want to understand something about the nature of understanding, then these really foundational things like, what's going on between these eggs and sperm? This is a topic that won't fail to enlighten you about almost anything. It's a hyper topic, right?
Completely unexposed, but lots of
So, a sperm hits the egg. The little packet buries itself in the cell wall. Right on the other side of where it landed, the spirochete, the mitochondrial racehorse, is still alive and sort of wiggling and trying to, do something useful. One imagines that the packet and the mitochondria are in intimate communication, or the packet and the spirochete, the packet and the tail, such that, in a way, this might be the organism's first experience of the loss of a companion, right? And a lot of people feel as if I've never noticed this, what I'm about to say before. In fact, the companion loss, I've spoken of that, but not the implications. So imagine that the masculine aspect of your original body had two parts. And the feminine aspect was like a billion lunar cycles of information. In other words, the egg. Yeah. Many people suggest or say that they have the feeling that there used to be a twin, that the other part of them wasn't born. And in some cases, this is blatantly a fact, right? There may have been a companion embryo that was aborted, or perhaps they are remembering something. Perhaps there was a previous child who didn't get born, and there's structured memory about that associated with the womb. In the same way that children's rooms are highly uncharactered, each child who arises in the womb, we should imagine in characters the womb, so that the next child grows up in their older siblings, in a library of their older siblings' transformations relationally, with found intimacy here, right? Because the child in the womb are essentially one being. And it needn't be highlighted that every human being that we know of, with maybe 2 or 3 exceptions, or some small number of exceptions, test tube children, was first an organ in the body of a female. So, any attempt to denigrate women is not only wildly unfounded, but openly ignorant. All right, so many humans have the sense of a lost sibling, and I'm sure there are many interesting and useful psychological explanations for this, but nobody ever thought that perhaps the packet of sperm remembers its traveling companion, the one who brought it to the egg and got it there on time and in the right situation, and everything was perfect, and right. But then that being that is the packet was parted from its traveling element at the cell membrane and had to leave it, and probably was in touch with it over the span of time, after which that element is deceased. It essentially had to watch its horse die. And that companion aspect turns out to be really important in ways that today I'm probably not going to get to, although I might. So some chemistry changes in the egg cell then. And these are things we should have been taught as children, right? The fact that I had to live to be 40 before I had to have a non-human intelligence direct me through human literature to understand these matters, and to understand them with reverence, right? Not merely with abstract efficacy. No, with reverence, because these matters are holy. They are sacred matters. Not because we make them sacred. They are intrinsically sacred matters, which is part of why they comprise hypertopics. What is he wearing? So, once the desired sperm of what can be chosen from, supposedly, of the local sperm, has successfully penetrated the membrane, and I'm sure there's a word for that membrane, a technical term that I don't know. The egg locks the gate, right? The egg undergoes some physical changes at the molecular chemistry level, I think, and the gate's locked. Future sperm will bounce off. Of course, it is sometimes true that twins, there are cases of triplets and so forth, right, win. And that might have to do with the mechanics of the timing of sperm arrival, or the mechanics of the eggs, the temporal interval over which the egg locks the gate, so to speak. So that happens, and then I think it's called a blastocyst is formed, and that's going to become a human being. But it's going to go through a lot of complex transformations over time. And this isn't human time. 9 months at the scale of the cell, that might be long enough to reiterate the history of the universe, right? Especially if you have an exponentially growing colony of cells, which is what the egg effectively becomes. And by exponentially, it just means, 2 cells. The egg splits into the vegetal pole and the animal pole, I believe that's what it's called. That's the first evidence of binary polarity. People will argue like, there's no such thing as binaries. Wrong. Wrong. Transferring their existence in various ways to category theory can get you in trouble under some circumstances. Often it's crucial. Is that thing boiling hot or not, right? That's an important distinction. Am I on fire or not, right? There's lots of binary features of our lexical and categorical consciousness that are crucial to preserve. And I'm going to be so bold as to suggest that man and woman are one of them. Egg and sperm, not the same thing. You can scream at sperm all you want and tell them they don't carry the masculine, right? It is true that they carry both, right? They're propelled by the mitochondrial DNA. And the packet varies in its content, I believe. I don't think do they only contribute? I can't remember. Shit. That's really bad. I can't remember the contribution of the sperm in terms of the chromosomes. Okay, maybe I'll have to add that in the notes, embarrassingly. In any case, you get the animal pole and the vegetal pole. And the egg is not the contribution of the man. The sperm is not the contribution of the woman. Right? Male and female are actual biological categories. And the fact that there's a little blur around the edges, notwithstanding, these are crucial categorical foundations that must be preserved in my perspective. And I can't wait for the attacks. And I'm actually happy to have the conversation because how we speak of gender generally, first of all, shouldn't be policed or cancel culpable, vulnerable. But we could speak of it in a broad variety of useful ways, unless some cohort thinks they have the right to make universal declarations about it, even to overturn the fundamental polarity therein structured in physical biology, right? This is saying, there's no tree there. In any case, you get the animal and the vegetal pole, and this goes on to further divide into pluripotent cell structures. These are cells that can become any of the cells in the body. And by the way, that technology is pretty fucking incredible. We should also notice that this is what nature is doing, right? Nature is using a superposition to generate a specific array of subpositions. And the superposition is superior to all possible productions at the scale of physical representation, or in the register of physical representation. And so I think those two polarities essentially become the animal and vegetal, and I'm not positive about this, But I think they become they're sort of related to outside and inside physically. The vegetal pole may be the inside, if I remember correctly, producing the organs and bones and such. But I'm actually not a biologist, and it's been many years since I've even had the urge to think about these things, like probably 20 or 30. In any case, you see here the beginnings of bipolarity. Right? Another thing that's always hilarious is when we are bilaterally comprised animals, in the sense that it's as if we're split down the middle by a line, and we have a right hand and a left hand and a right foot and a left foot and a right eye and a left eye and a right ear and a left ear, right nostril, left nostril, right ovary, left ovary, right lung sac, left lung sac. And I think it's actually important that only one side of our body contains, so to speak, using the container metaphor in English, which I mistrust, the heart. And we associate our heart with emotions, and that's partly because our heart changes when our emotional manifold transforms. Our heart changes. We feel it change. Now, I'm sure people could form good arguments against that, but, physicalist arguments. So the beginnings of this bihemispheric situation lie in the egg cell, right? And its first division. It forms a polarity, and that polarity develops over time. And by the way, I don't know how it is with your ears, but your right eye and your left eye, the right eye is, I think it's a doubled situation. Let me explain. So the right eye probably belongs more to the left hemisphere, just as the right hand, right foot, and so forth do. But it appears from what we've been able to learn by mechanical study that both eyes are split so that the right half of both eyes belongs to the left hemisphere and vice versa. Now that's a really interesting arrangement. Apparently, both aspects need both eyes. Or rather, the possibility of losing an eye has to be adjusted for by giving both hemispheres access to both. You have probably noticed, as a human being, at some point in your life, whether or not you're still aware of it, that food tastes and feels different on different sides of your mouth. And probably in the middle. People who are not right-handers and to some degree that is imposed on us, but there is a relatively natural inclination underneath those impositions. I'm not sure if it's for the right hand, by the way. It could well be left hand early in life, right hand later in life. And I wouldn't be surprised to discover that particular situation obtains. So you can see that, now look, underneath let's be really clear, most people who haven't really looked carefully at a diagram of the brain, they will imagine that the right hemisphere is the right side of the brain and the left hemisphere is the left side. Ordinarily, what is being referred to is a layer of tissue on the surface, comprising kind of a hat, if you will, with two elements and connective tissue between them. That's the corpus callosum. And those hats are maybe, I don't know exactly. Let's think like a half to 3/4 of an inch in thickness, and they're wrinkled. And the wrinkling gives you more surface area by like a lot more. The wrinkles that we see in preserved brains deprived of the dura, which is the circulatory tissue that feeds them blood, I think, on the very surface. And I have actually seen these things firsthand. Like, I know they exist because sometime in the mid-90s I went into an operating room with the neurosurgeon Frances Conley at Stanford and observed brain surgery for 8 hours, just stood right next to her while she opened up someone's head and pointed out the various features of the anatomy. Which I was super fascinated by. Kind of a dangerous and crazy situation what actually took place there, but that's a different story. All right. So, the cortexes are the structures on the top of the brain, essentially. And they form a kind of a pecan shape from the side, right? A crescent. They meet in the center, and they're subject inside the skull to a kind of a twisting called Yakovlevian torque, I believe. I learned this term from E.A. McGilchrist. And that means that the brain case itself is sort of twisted to one side. I can't remember if it's clockwise or counterclockwise, but I think it's clockwise, meaning that the left hemisphere has more tissue in the front, and the right hemisphere has more in the back. Yes, I think that's correct. And it's the frontal cortex, right, where representational cognition mostly lives. This is probably a relatively new feature in the evolution of our species, and particularly the ways it has developed over the past, say, 8 to 10,000 years, which is a very brief time in geological and evolutionary history. You're talking about a microsecond or something. And I would argue we're not, in order to develop the left hemisphere intelligently, an animal like ours would need outside guidance. Left to its own devices, representational cognition will destroy all life. Without, I would argue that if we could look at a million planets where creatures somewhat like us develop representational cognition, those unguided by other intelligences would fail at a probably 90% rate right around the time they start being able to make bombs, and very, very few of them would survive. And then there would be some that had generated an apocalypse, but some humans lived, or some of the some of the representational cognitives lived and preserved the stories of what happened, but you'd still have the same problem. They in the same way, children won't develop representational cognition at all if raised by animals. And there's only a certain phase of their development within which they are inclined to be able to develop it, right? Wild children brought home from the wilderness can't learn English and don't care about the bizarre rituals and absurdities of society. objects, rituals, and absurdities. Behaviors, objects, rituals, and absurdities. They are animals, mostly. And so you can see that in our species there's a specific phase of our development in our own lives, right? In my life and your life. We went through this phase, and it's important to understand that we were recapitulating, to imagine, I should say, that we were recapitulating the developmental history of our species as we developed from infants to wherever we are now. There was a phase during which we were inclined to be able to be enlanguaged and enculturated. And if we were enlanguaged and enculturated by an actually advanced, intelligent people, then we would acquire their skills, defenses against ignorance and coercion, and all the broad arrays of intelligences that humans are fully capable of developing in an intelligent context. Unfortunately, nearly zero of the children will find themselves born into one. So we're born into toxically deformed contexts. And that's crippling, though many of us eventually develop a sort of a two-mind system, right? And of course, it's much more than that. We have a secret mind, a secret plus companion's mind, a companion's mind, a social mind, and a public mind. And, many people perhaps don't differentiate between those. We also have like business and private and all these other kinds of little sub-mind compartments, so to speak. The poor human children. So on planets where there's no actual intelligence and the humans break, right, the representational animal breaks off from nature, which is a source of infinitely diverse natural intelligences, and is probably the telephone. Right? If you got to call mom or dad, and you need to send a signal, the way to do that is through nature. So if you send the signal, for example, let's say you have a species that doesn't realize nature is the phone, so they start tearing that stuff down and burning it up and making little representations of, rectangles in banks and things. They may think that doesn't send a signal, but everything in time-space gets the signal, especially all the creatures on your home planet and all the ecologies. And that's the worst, effectively the worst signal you could possibly send. The best signal you could send is, hello. We recognize that we belong to an ancient family, and we are calling because we are in trouble. That would be a decent signal. Of course, you have to be careful. Time-space is a lot like a forest. If you start yelling, help, help, then you might attract predators. So you need to tailor the signal and the way it is sent in such a way as to produce good recipients, right? And to select for good recipients. Desirable recipients is another way of saying it, or beneficent or altruistic participants. And the altruistic participants don't tend to be highly military, but they're very powerful. They're powerful for a weirder way than the military participants. They're powerful because every being that ever existed is on their side, right? Like the entire line of your ancestors would stand up in their graves and cheer if a truly beautiful altruistic act or situation were accomplished. I mean, this is what the idea of triumph actually means. It doesn't mean perverse incentive zero-sum games. That is not what it means. And there are intelligences even within us, right? The human cognitium is sort of a mirror of the intelligences of time-space. What you can find in there, you can find in time-space. So you can find things like the misbehaviors that terrify and horrify us. And you can also find intelligences inclined and empowered to perform astonishing, beautiful, restorative, noble, honorable, dignified situations, right? Transformations of situations. All right, the hemispheres. So, here's where I'm going to branch here, probably, unless there's something else I need to say about the hemispheres. So first of all, normally they're both active and they both contribute to consciousness, but the representational aspect is trained to dominate our lives and bodies, our nervous systems and so forth to a degree, in childhood as we undergo in languaging and enculturation. And there's a lot of different ways to look at these processes and many useful and intelligent purposes that can direct our explorations. It's not that the right hemisphere is good and the left is bad. It's something far weirder than that. It's that okay, well, there's different ways of thinking about it. One is just that as, McGilchrist characterizes McGilchrist characterizes the right hemisphere as the master and the left hemisphere as the emissary. And spins the tale. There's a similar, what I was shown was that Cain and Abel in the Bible represent this. Though it's very confusing now. It's confusing because it's so much more complex than I originally was able to understand. But McGilchrist paints it as if over the developmental time of our species, and particularly over the recent span, recent being maybe 25,000 years, just kind of a random number there, but not too random, the emissary became so powerful that it largely occluded the master. And what is the master? Is this some kind of slave? No, it's not that at all. It's you would probably prefer not to have to drive your car with a foot, right? And your pinky is super important on your hand and enables many features. You can get along without it. But what you actually need is a palm, right? You need a place that unifies the members. And you also need a wrist, right, that leads upscale to the directing intelligences that animate the members according to purposes. So what you wouldn't want is your hand leading your body around. What you want is your mind leading your body around. And even then, you're in danger if the representational aspects dominate for lots of reasons. They're super powerful and useful tools, but it's like being dominated by a tool. And you actually need your heart and your dreaming mind and your creativity, your playfulness, your intelligence. All of these things are crucially important contributors to the context of consciousness. Right? So if you just become very clinical, then you're likely to end up in a situation with perverse incentives and zero-sum games. And you're even likely to end up in that situation at the register of yourself, right? Like your own psyche and stuff. So the master in this model, maybe master is the wrong word, I would just like the unified, the tree of unified intelligences of origin or something like this, which is what I imagine the right hemisphere to resemble. They must be above, they must not be encompassed, silenced, or have their resources shunted off into left hemispheric styles of living and thought and so forth. Or rather, I mean, the way that I think of it is like the right hemisphere is origin, and the left hemisphere is the laboratory. Okay? So the right hemisphere is memory in the sense of evolutionary, filial, originary intelligences, and so forth. But the left hemisphere is the representation of those. So the left hemisphere is a bit more like a museum where the old skills and abilities are there in structure, but dead inside, kind of. Right? And the tools are very powerful, but you don't want your right hand going around attacking your body. The universe, right? The world, the sun, the earth, right? Or processing them either. So there's this crazy imbalance in us, and it becomes, the ironic thing is, Gilchrist and I both were aware that we could use the tools to serve the original purposes of the trustworthy aspects of our consciousness and psycholinguistic concerns. Just need to test my mic here. Test. Okay. Now, there's a whole long story here about the strange evidence for the conflict and the problems that arise from it. So the idea of rectitude, correctness, the idea of being right, getting it right, right? All of these have to do with the predilection in conceptual awareness for the structured aspect. One of the things the right hemisphere does rather adequately, or even in a very profound way, is to interrupt narratives that have gone sideways and are starting to become religions in the left hemisphere's sort of way of life.
Sorry, you okay? No, it's okay. Sit down. Like this.
There's so much to say here. The circle is probably the most primordial form in terms of forms. The angle is also primordial, but to a much lesser degree. If an angle is part of a triangle. If an angle is a radian, that's super important to darn near everything. I was just watching two young boys, right? And they're just like stomping away on the ground, and they're really interested in what they're stomping on. And this I do find very peculiar. I mean, this looks to me like kind of a failure on the part of the parents, but one of the little boys, after stomping away madly and then looking at the bottom of his shoe for evidence of successful stomping, he said, I want to destroy more. So they went looking for more creatures to obliterate. I wonder what the right hemisphere's role in that is, if any. That might be like the kind of the evidence of the ascending domination of left hemisphere-like features. You see, there's no connection to the life forms there. And it should be relatively obvious that at least at the scale of cohorts, right, our societies, civilizations, corporations, and so forth, we perform transactions in the biosphere as if nature doesn't matter, is dead inside, is just there to be converted to commodities and representations of value or power or longevity and so forth. And so huge problems here. Yeah, vast trouble. Now, I'm not sure what's going on in the little boys. They're early in their developmental cycle, but by 3, they've already been thoroughly infected with representational cognition. And by the way, what did I mean earlier when I said on worlds where the development of repcog is not intelligently guided by external intelligences or think of the concept of symbiosis, the embryogenesis of human representational cognition, or, of the alpha representational on a planet like ours, whatever that creature might look like. I would suggest that it's very likely that in the early development and throughout perhaps the first, 300,000-400,000 years of our development, we were associated with non-human intelligences, possibly a broad array of types of them. But it's not my goal here to go on and on about that topic. I just want to point out that imagine a science fiction story and what happens to the children in a situation where right around the age of those boys I just saw, right around that age, all parents disappear. So they've been infected with representational cognition, and they're going to continue to develop it, but without the guiding intelligence of experienced beings. Right? Experienced at what? Experienced at having minds and forming minds both individually and together, which is the most important thing you can do. If you're not doing that, now, there are still helpers here on Earth, even if there are none in the sky. Right? None in the beyond of time-space, none in time-space itself. The Earth is a library of anciently evolved symbiotic intelligences. And we can contact and learn from them because we are made of them And quite possibly we were made for them. The humans turn out to be something resembling the shepherds of life on earth, whether or not that was a God-given role. Because of our prowess with technology, we will decide, at least for the near-term evolutionary future, if life continues, and also which lives continue. In other words, which forms, right? Not necessarily by, looking at a list and going like, okay, let's preserve the tigers and the platypus, right? The mantis shrimp, yeah, okay. But we have this power because of the decisions we make at the scale of our societies and civilizations. Have a determinative influence on the future. Left and right. Left-handers are much more commonly ambidextrous and have certain tasks that they prefer to do with each hand. You can see that the idea of preference for handedness has a much deeper expression in left-handers, where not only are they often ambidextrous or partly ambidextrous, there are certain tasks that they prefer one side to work with. It seems hard to imagine. There are probably benefits to both, but it's hard to imagine that there are profound benefits to favoring a single hand. Evolutionarily, developmentally, all kinds of features and perspectival orientations are important. And usually, if you have more options, you're better off, especially if you can combine them. I never intended to... It's so funny what happens when I start to make a recording, because sometimes it's usually I have a specific idea in mind, right? And often what happens is that I get carried away with the preamble, because there's some interesting sights to see in thought and imagination in that direction. So I get really excited about the preamble. So the actual thing that started this recording for me today was a topic that I've only been relatively recently introduced to. Now, obviously, I grew up in California. My parents were progressive liberals for my young life and instilled liberal values in me. What do liberal values really mean? They mean... So progressive means we want a better future for us and our children that capitalizes on the principles of human cooperation and equality. It means something like that. Equality where? Equality before the law and before the treatment in and of society. Also, privacy. Fundamental, important human virtue, privacy. Fuck that up, you're screwed. You're going to get totalitarian societies in the next 10 seconds. So it's not just the freedom to speak in public, it's the freedom to speak unobserved in private. And also the freedom to live unsurveilled. Now, the left and the right may share some portion of both of those values, whatever the left and the right refer to, presuming that the political left and the political right refer to actual things, which is a pretty big presumption, especially today, when nearly any word you can select no longer refers to actual things. And my son's 9-year-old niece turned to him yesterday and said, "I don't think we're living in reality anymore," after seeing a horse with a beard in the park, a real one. And I don't think that the horse was actually the cause of the comment. I'm not sure. I honestly, look, I don't even know what to say. I'm fairly articulate. I know many other articulate minds, and I've listened to many of them. And one of the most commonly said things today is, "I can't make sense of anything anymore. Nothing makes sense. Identity doesn't seem to exist. The categories are all exploded and blurry and being manipulated on purpose for a variety of psyops," and so forth. And I think a lot of that's true. In fact, the psyop part is really for sure true. And what we're not realizing on the left, which, like I said, I was lefty most of my whole life, no longer. I'm not sure what I am, but the forces which have captured the left look to me to be, there's a few gems in there, right? It's not all poison, but that looks really psyop-y. And similarly, the forces that have captured the right look really psyop-y, but one of them is less likely to get us killed right away, and it isn't the left. Oh my goodness, what are you? Okay, this is really something. What are you? I guess you are a form of carp? Carp are gathering together right next to turtles gathering together in what must be either sunbathing or pre-mating behavior, or both. What must be? See how the left hemisphere works? It must be this or that. On the other hand, you can't just get rid of binaries. It's perfectly, I just want to make one statement before I continue. There's no problem with human beings inventing new territory or exploring gender. I mean, there's certain places I would personally draw the line, but I wouldn't try to draw it for others much at all. What's not cool is people telling us there's no such thing as women, and then demanding that we have the same. That if we don't lockstep with their category transforms, we are bad or fascists or shouldn't be allowed to speak, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Shouldn't be engaged in conversation, and so on. Or that we would be punished for saying something like, there are primarily two genders associated with humans. The things we have invented at the outskirts are experimental, and it is not incumbent on anyone other than those who wish to assert them as facts. Probably getting some mud on my face here, but that's okay. I'm willing. So this right and the left thing, all right, here's the actual problem. When I was a kid, I was very patriotic. I thought this is the greatest country on earth. America, the brave, the brilliant, the beautiful, the true. I don't think there was ever anything quite like that going on, but there were phases where it was pretty good, and it certainly wasn't the worst. Now, when you have a group of monsters, the fact that you've been enslaved by the best monster of the group doesn't help a lot because the monster is still going to be doing horrible things in which you will become complicit. And until we actually develop, even on a small scale of 10 to 15 people, something resembling an intelligent collective upon whose purposes and perspectives and orientations we may lay our trust with relative, sureness, until we establish something that's intelligent. We are associated with cultures and societies and corporations and shit based on where we're born and when we're born. So these things are inherited in a way. We didn't build the societies we live in. They landed on us. And we don't have to do this. But if we're not going to do it, we have to do something better. Right? We can't just go do something worse or go do something ridiculous. Though, sometimes doing something ridiculous in the name of making a statement can be useful. But my point is this. Over the ensuing years after my childhood, when I learned more about war, corporations, technology, ecological devastation, prisoneering, propaganda, and all of these things, it became very clear to me that my country was not good. It was not a country I would agree with. And of the two branches of politics, if they're conceived as a binary, basically described as, quote, democratic and, quote, conservative, or democratic progressive or conservative, and or with some liberal, in there somewhere, whatever the hell that means. And then eventually things like libertarianism and all the little sub-chunks, right? I always identified as a liberal Democrat, whether or not I participated in the voting process, which is such a sham that it's almost like, I don't even know. Do I want to put my face in a sewer? And then, how can I possibly vote for things that I have no, that I did not myself compose, nor did I agree to compose with others, and to which I and my children and everyone I know will be subject. How can I? That just seems fundamentally bad. Unless you have an intelligent, voluntarily organized society, the concept of democracy is impossible to implement. What you get are very complex thrift-like diseases masquerading as virtuous. It's bath time for the ducks here. They're having a little group bath. Recently someone asked me to comment on the situation between Israel and Palestine, and I'm just making that bookmark. Whatever the hell became of the political parties in the United States, both of them descended into open insanity. Just like straight up power play nonsense, rivalrous dynamics, bullshit lying, propaganda control, favor trading, backroom dealing, underhanded conservation of assets across generations of wealth, crime, just straight up fucking rape, murder, drug dealing, you name it. All that shit is going on. And the organs, particularly the military, bureaucratic, prison, and political organs of our nation, are mostly counterfeit. Intentionally counterfeited. And there doesn't seem any possibility of correcting them. Though we'd probably be wiser to retrofit them than to just dispose of them wholesale, presuming that even something like that is possible. Of course, something like that will happen if there's a major war. But here's the thing. I understand the history of my nation to some degree. At least, the span from the before of colonization to the waves of colonization that took place, and also many of the complexities of that process that are not ordinarily, to common people. I know something of that history. I'm not an expert. And I'm not claiming that the founders of the colonized nation of the United States were beneficial altruists, but they took some principles that were pretty profound and encoded them as foundations. I also don't know the histories of the foundations of other nations, but I suspect that many of them lie in war and colonization. Not all of them. I don't know. But I was born here, and I live here. And if something directly threatens the nation I live in, I am unlikely to side with it. There are perhaps examples of exceptions. Missions that intend to build actually intelligent societies might get my attention or my participation, my cooperation. But if someone wants to take down the United States, I'm not on their side. And if they want to take down any foreign nation, I'm not on their side. With some exceptions, right? If that nation is acting cruelly or inhumanely or stupidly or aggressively, then just like, the drunk guy at the bar, we need to cope with this somehow. Hopefully blows don't have to be exchanged. But if they do, then let's do so as effectively and quickly and uninjuriously as possible. And here's the problem. Other nations have set their sights on the United States. On acquiring it, controlling it, or possibly destroying it. And it's not because they have a better idea of how to be human, or they intend to rescue the planet from nuclear devastation or some noble mission. It's a straight up military objective. Right? It's a military economic objective. And in the beginning of problems with immigration, my ancestors were immigrants here. Our country has generally been a sort of haven, right, for others, and particularly those who suffered religious, sectarian, gender-based, any kind of persecution in their home country that was serious. Our country maintains a sort of a balance sheet of how many foreign people we can import. And I'm well aware that people from specific countries come here, particularly South America, in search of a better life for them and their families, and also to escape, catastrophic hardship. What was that about? That was weird. However, I don't know how to solve the immigration problem, and I think it's very complex. And I don't even really understand the scope of the immigration problem like an expert or even a well-educated person. What I know is that each day, somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000 people from other countries pour into our nation. And there is a question about, does anyone actually possess their own nation? Is it a possession? What is it? What's the relationship there? Or are we the conservators of a nation? Over the past couple months, listening to experts, usually ex-CIA or ex-Green Berets, talking about topics like the Darien Gap, which you can look up, and what's going on with China. And one of them had written 3 books on, what was it? Chinese information warfare. And who interviewed him? Maybe, was it Chris Williams? I'm not sure. He went down to the Darien Gap and sort of checked into what was going on down there. This is a place where thousands of immigrants heading for the United States show up every day, and where they are fleeced and murdered and raped and tortured, except the Chinese, who mostly aren't. And the Chinese have their own camps, you can't get into them. And it's clear that these are not ordinary immigrants. After having, spoken with a number of them, many of those spoken with were clearly not ordinary Chinese people. These were trained intelligence agents coming into the United States by the thousands per month, and sometimes, the tens of thousands per week. Now, something should be obvious, which is that wars are expensive and dangerous and painful, but there's like 50 ways you can avoid direct conflict, and one of them is just by replacing another nation's population with your own, internally. And here's the actual problem that I'm facing presently. Many of the ideas, many of the ideologies that presently dominate the Democratic Party, what we might think of as the left, and maybe there's a left part of the right, as well, so to speak. These words are very loosely applied. Many of the imperatives that currently orient the left are lethally dangerous to the future of the possibility of our nation. I've never been much of a patriot, but what I'm seeing going on now is catastrophically stupid. The left's idea that anyone who wants to live here should just come on over, we're all better together, is fucking insane and won't work. Because there are bad actors, and it's the same thing as we'll just, let's just give our military to every nation who wants a piece of it. We should have better solutions than military conflict as of, 200 years ago, at least. But in a world where we don't, You can't just do away with the military because you're a nice guy and want to be a good neighbor. Similarly, you can't ignore immigration issues because those people become voters and they become economic powers inside your own nation. In the same way you don't like go down to the store, buy cancer and swallow some directly. Anyone with any concern for our nation at all would realize that our government is absolutely failing to protect the future and the present of our nation as regards this specific problem. We are not formally paying the proper kind of attention to the issue. Hi. Clades with strong subcultures that enter our nation will establish those subcultures, and their subcultures and their behaviors will select for participants in those subcultures and will establish themselves as powers socially, economically, religiously, politically, as if the United States, the existing milieu of the United States is just a petri dish filled with various nourishment media. Right? Now, someone could argue, yes, that's the whole idea of this experiment. No, it fucking isn't. Obviously, we should reforge our nation every 30 to 50 years. I think, that principle is something I took from the founding documents, quote unquote, which we never did. And that's part of why we're in such a fucking mess. We being, we actual Americans. And look, I'm very aware that immigrants from other nations come to America and do provide, in terms of the structured systems we have in place, the economic systems, the commercial systems, all of these, they show up and they do hard work. They work really fucking hard in many cases. They're not just sitting at home, watching TV, getting a check from the government every month, though perhaps some portion of them are. They participate meaningfully in our economy, and in some ways, better than some percentage of our own people do. However demoralized and disaffected our own people may be. China is pouring agents into this country. We've seen the same strategy elsewhere. There's Monty Python cartoons about it that I've seen. So they must have done it in Britain as well. In my own neighborhood, and I'm not saying this to be racist, I am profoundly outnumbered by Asians, and over 30 years, what does it mean, I am profoundly outnumbered by Asians? I am now a minority. Okay, other people have experienced that, no problem, but why am I a minority? I'm a minority because of a massive transfer of wealth generationally. Let me be really clear. It is extremely expensive to live in San Francisco, even if your housing is taken care of. Where is all the money coming from? Why is there, over the past 30 years, for example, the number of restaurants in my neighborhood that are Asian has probably quadrupled. Right now, I don't mean the number, I mean the prevalence, like a 4-fold increase. When I walk around on the street, probably a third of the people that I see are Asian. And I'm not biased against Asian people. In fact, quite the opposite. I've been a student of Asian culture since my early 20s. I studied Tai Chi. I made some attempts at learning kanji and have studied a bit of Chinese language and Japanese language. I am a xenophile. I love human beings. I love all the different kinds of human beings. And when humans from other cultures and or ethnicities and or genders show up around me, I'm usually fascinated and, open to collaborative being human together. But that's not what's going on. What's going on is kind of a sectarian, right? A chunk. Huh. Wow. There is a lot of action here. Are those really carp? Now we've got carp, minnows, and turtles all hanging out in the warm spot. But I can't actually tell if those are carp. They don't look like bass, catfish, or... In terms of international politics, the Chinese are anciently intelligent, right? This is a civilization that makes America look like, a 4-year-old. They play the long game, generally speaking, and because their efforts are fundamentally intrinsically unified under the party, in a way that ours are not, that no Western nations really are, communism is very likely to win any kind of military or domineering game over time. Historically, the capacity for the development of new technologies was one of the things that kept our nation relatively dominant. But we have failed catastrophically as a nation to capitalize, even in the regular representational senses, right? Of policy, economics, law, education, healthcare. We have totally failed to take care of our nation, its infrastructure, our people, their well-being, their future, which is the reason we have a nation. Now, you can think like, well, I'm anti-national. Great. If this thing falls apart with you in it, what you're going to see prevail in the place of the relatively benign systems that you see today will be abject tyranny, right? You won't want to be alive in that kind of a thing. So whether or not you're a fan of the United States, per se, we take our nation for granted. We presume it will always be there, that it's at least relatively stable and reliable, and so that is not the case. I'm sorry, it's just not true. Pragmatically, I mean, unless you want to live in Red China or under a Russian czar, you'd better take care of what you've got, right? And actually care about it, even if you oppose many of its transformations and policies. This is our nation.
Yeah, so it's like there are like right? 5 rooms, and one of them is largely Joseph Biden.
And it's not just our nation, it's pivotal in world politics. If our nation were to fall either via conflict or internal transformation by being flooded with immigrants, particularly say from China and or Iran, Syria, etc., Hamas, Hezbollah, you're not going to like the outcome, right? It's going to be, living here will be misery. But if our nation falls the rest of the nations are next in line, right? The rest of the democracies are going. They're not going to be able to stand on their own. Whether or not we are truly good or benevolent or intelligent has nothing to do with it. You've got the ravenous maws, so to speak, of various corporate and national players that are racing for dominance, and we have to protect our own nation whether we are patriots or not. It's the nation we live in. And it does take care of us to a degree. And here's the problem. On the left, which is where my mind, imagines I would be, right? We have a bunch of imperatives that are supporting the enemies of our nation and creating factions within, causing political schizogenesis, right, into smaller and smaller tribal cohorts. And some of the ideals that have infected the left, the DEI nightmare, which again, virtue, it's so bizarre that the branch of dialectic concerned and that introduced to us the phrase virtue signaling is also the branch compromised by that. People have attacked the idea of meritocracy, and I'm still sort of digesting some of those attacks. But a friend of mine who'd been a nurse in a neonatal trauma ward for 30 years and is about to retire. Right? This woman worked in Vietnam of women's rights and women's bodies. She was in her retirement speech, which she has to have vetted by the administration. She said that a woman who had inspired, she was talking about a woman who had inspired her and how articulate she was. And I said, "You can't say articulate." And my friend said, "What?" They're like, "Yeah, you can't use that word because it segments people into a hierarchy, and the people who are not included will be offended. The people who are not articulate may take offense." I think they actually went so far as to call that hate speech, right? In other words, to sing the virtues of another human is hate speech because those humans who have not achieved or will feel somehow deprived of human value or so. Yeah, what the actual fuck is going on? I mean, that same woman underwent a long, complex assault on her moral and ethical inclusive behavior. I mean, this is someone who spends her life arguing for inclusion. So we have this problem where there's essentially a library of thrisps or mental diseases that have somehow been injected into the left under the guise of producing equality, valuing diversity, and being inclusive of all people, right? This is the idea of equal treatment. That's what's on the flag, right? The idea of equal treatment. What's underneath it, I don't fucking know, but I mistrust it catastrophically. It has the stink of psyops all around it to me. So it's very confusing for me in this phase of my life. I watched my father become conservative as he got older, and I was like, what the fuck is wrong with him? What is he thinking? Right? This can't be good. He votes Republican? What? My dad? But I now, and it's not just because of aging, right? It's not just that I've aged. I can see there's a real danger here of our country being taken apart from the inside and essentially taken over from the inside, along with the problem of the catastrophic inefficiency of bureaucratic government, right? That's a real fucking thing. We as a people, if we were unified, it's all good. If we as a people were unified with and for each other in the history of future of life on Earth, as I might say, then, we could fund our government with probably 6% of what it currently requires for funding, maybe 12 at the most. And we could fund the military with probably 10% of what it presently devours. And we could have an effective, efficient economic, political, and hopefully ideological nation. Right now what we have is the opposite of that. But even that is incredibly valuable, and it mustn't fall. If it falls, the rest of the planet's going with it, to whatever force takes it over. So, if you don't want your grandkids, presuming that we get to have any, marching around in little red costumes with a star on their pocket, I don't care what your politics are. You have to care about the history and future of this nation, which is our nation, if you're American. And if you live in a Western nation, which is allied with the United States, then, this also has to be your concern, because your nation won't survive, very unlikely to survive, the devastation of ours. You might not like grocery stores, but if they go away, what are you going to do, right? Grocery stores are a huge problem, I agree. The trash, the products, the poison, the money, the politics, the power, I get it. So, yeah, we're in bad trouble. It's clear that China has set its sights on the United States, and they're pouring well-trained, cooperative Chinese, mostly young men, into our nation daily. Right? I mean, you had a cup of coffee, it's getting filled with motor oil. I mean, it doesn't take much motor oil that's not coffee anymore, right? How much motor oil do you got to put in there? Not much. So it's very peculiar for me in my accelerated decrepitude to find myself concerned in a similar way about immigration. This problem must be solved. This cannot be bait for political, accusation, counter-accusation, bullshit debates of lying politicians. This has to be dealt with. This nation won't survive. Many of the modern nations are facing, in the near-term future, monumental waves of immigration. And how are they going to cope with that? If we have a society with any degree of intelligence at all, the problem must be seen as crucially important and has to be addressed in a multi-partisan display of actual human intelligence about the future of our country. So I'm quite concerned about this. China's doing a lot of very weird things, and they may be straight up psyoping the United States, the citizens, both for and against. Like, once you have an issue that can divide Americans, just pump that shit up and you win. It's really easy to overcome an opponent that has 16 fucking conflicting directives in consciousness. Oh yeah.
At least
Do you
two.
know Nancy DeStephanis, who the Heron lady?
I've seen her. I've never met her.
Yeah. Oh, she's quite a character.
Well, I hadn't seen the second one, but I just saw it.
Yeah, there's 3.
Oh, okay. I haven't seen it. Probably from the island. You could see a third one.
Yeah, much easier to see them in the evening. So, all right. So, the thing that I really wanted to point out here is that many of the ideological underpinnings of current left-leaning politics, which, for example, what are they doing that's really troubling to me? If I'm going to have brain surgery, or if my banker is going to do something with my investments, right? Or if there's a complex threat to my security, health, or well-being, what I don't want is people who were selected based on some criteria about how many people of each ethnicity, religious belief, gender perspective we need to get on the team so that everybody's equally represented. What I want are experts. I don't care what their, the selecting criteria is demonstrations of skillfulness and efficacy at doing whatever it is that's crucial to our survival, or, the
one person's going to row on this, 2 people are going to pedal. So it's up to you.
Sorry, a little distracted there. Yeah, it's not so much merit as it is expertise, right? The demonstration of expertise. I don't want to go to a doctor that was given a certificate, not because they passed the boards or whatever, but because, for example, no, I'm not going to make an example. You can imagine the cartoon example I would make. They belong to this ethnicity, this peculiar variation of human gender, and this peculiar ideological and or religious background. No. We need, in the places within our society that demand skill, we need people with skill, not people who were selected to fulfill a quota system, right? The underlying milieu among the Democrats is apparently
Someone to literally be like,
something loopy, which is apparently it's like pro-immigration or something. Yeah, let everybody come in who wants to come in, or something like this. I don't even know. I don't actually know, but the functional outcome of the battle in our political system, the battle between 19 different lying factions, each lying for their own reasons, is going to get us snuffed. It's not going to work even in the short term. You can't let hundreds of thousands of people per month from other countries pour into our nation and conserve the structure of the polis at all. And that structure, our nation and the future of many other nations depends on it. Whether we like it, whether we approve or not isn't the question. It's a structural thing. If you pull the pin on that grenade, the planet is going to go off. Right? So I'm quite concerned about what I've learned about that recently, and I take it very seriously. And I'm certainly neither a Republican nor a Democrat anymore, but although I believe in the idea of an intelligent democracy, I've never seen one established. The exception cases are small groups, perhaps resembling like the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society or something. small integral groups who function for the sake of a noble mission together. That can work out well. But I've never seen a nation established according to these principles. Ours was counterfeited, very quickly after its inception and taken over by interests of power, money, actual prisoneering, and so forth. So that's a big mess. Now, where am I here? Okay. So there's one. I'm very concerned that I hear people speaking Chinese all the time all around me, and I love the sound of other languages, and I love the diversity of the place in which I live. I actually do really believe fundamentally in diversity, but it has to be enacted. It can't be provisional, and it can't be diversity over, as an overlord, right? Either. It has to be naturally, to some degree, naturally enacted with, experiences of cooperative life paths and concern and education and so forth. Okay, so there's one more thing. I'm going to pause for a minute and see if I can come back with it. All right, Israel and Palestine. I'm not very well educated. I know little pieces of information about both, both sides. One of the problems we have today is that because false flags are possible, we have to consider them, even if the data doesn't immediately point in that direction, right? The United States has certainly conducted a number of crucial false flag operations to get us into wars. Now, the idea that somehow the Israelis cooperate, some faction within the Israeli government set up what happened is distant from my thought and concern. Nonetheless, I need to mention it because it's fucking 2024, and the faces, whatever we see on the face of phenomena, is just not even half of what's going on. No matter what might be going on, and I don't know what's going on there. I honestly don't. But taken at face value, killing civilians is fucking unjustifiable. I don't care who's doing it. I don't really care why. And the atrocities committed ostensibly by Hezbollah and Hamas are real atrocities. The atrocities responsively committed by Israel are real atrocities. These are fundamentally unjustifiable. Now, I've heard Sam Harris say things like, look, you got a bunch of people running around out there who are like, we're going to kill you and your children as an act of religious expression and faith. Like, we prefer killing you and your kids to our own survival, right? That you have to basically obliterate any faction of humans that thinks this way. You've got to get rid of them, especially if they're a significant threat. I've heard him say things like this. I don't really understand exactly what he means by get rid of them. Obviously he means kill them. But what does he mean? How do you determine who is them? Israel as a nation is endowed with the power to defend its interests with military might. But blowing up hospitals and schools, because this is where Hamas and Hezbollah like to hide their infrastructure, it's impossible to justify that. And again, I'm very ignorant on this topic, and so I don't really trust my own opinions, and I'm happy to be educated by those with other opinions. But most of the intellectual, intelligent Jewish people among my friend groups, they are not in favor of the slaughter of civilians. And, Israel's as a nation is not the same thing as the Jews. And Hamas and Hezbollah are not the same thing as the Palestinians. This is a very complex and problematical category problem here, again, right? And I've spoken of this in previous videos, I now remember. We shouldn't confuse Israel with Jewish people and Hamas and Hezbollah with Palestinian people. The fact that many of the participants fit into some, category notwithstanding, we need to think much more carefully about this. If anyone is standing around waving flags and cheering for the slaughter of, civilians, those people are the problem, and I don't really care what their ethnic or political or, nationalistic origin is. It's fundamentally inhuman and bad. So for the moment, I'm going to leave that there, remembering that I've discussed this in another of my recordings. So grateful to have had this time together. Thank you for joining me. Please take a moment to support my work in whatever way feels appropriate for you if you're enjoying it. I wish you beautiful days, relationships, and opportunities. Bye-bye for now.